Life Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost for the week of November 16th, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to get into this week's podcast, and I am excited. Here we are at the last, regular Sunday of the church year for year C. It's really an exciting place to be. Next week is Christ the King, and then right after that, boom, we are in Advent. So we are really right here knocking at the end of the year. It's been an amazing year to kind of go in and think about and contemplate what Luke is getting at. But I think it's also one of these moments here that we can really reflect and start getting into this reflection time of year. And we've talked a little bit about that, but I think it's this moment then to kind of be preparing us as we then will be moving into the year of Matthew, and Matthew has a much different tonality than Luke, and so it should be another great year to be preparing for that. But before we do that, let's jump into the question that we had for last week, which was, where are you being challenged to grow? And we had a great response this week, and the person responded with stating that they felt they needed to grow in wisdom, and saying, we have the quote of God saying, "Be still and know that I am God," but having the wisdom to be, a smart man knows what to say, but a wise man knows when to say it and when not to say it. And I think especially within the world in which we're in, this aspect of being able to decipher between that, I think, is a growing challenge, and it's a lifelong challenge for us to be working on, is being able to understand when to say things, when not to say things. I know I'll reflect back, and there's definitely moments within my life where I shouldn't have said things the way that I did, or reflecting on wishing that I had done things slightly differently. I think this is something that we continue to grow and continue to figure out throughout life. And so I argue that wisdom is a lifelong challenge that we all keep working on until we can no longer work on it. And so I think it's this aspect of something that challenges us to continue to grow day after day, year after year, decade after decade. So let's just jump into it this week. One of the Old Testament texts you could potentially be having is out of Isaiah chapter 65, verses 17 to 25. And this is this contemplation here of when the Israelites then are working on what is this new world that is eventually coming, this new Jerusalem, as we hear, that this idea of how the way that things have been and the way that at times people are dying at young age, and stating how time is going to be perceived differently, and that these inhabitants of the area will not necessarily be building something to leave, but that you're building something that's going to continue for generation after generation after generation. And that we get this last verse here in verse 25, that the wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. This idea of how the things that we have come accustomed to will suddenly no longer stand. This idea of how the world in which we have gotten accustomed to will be different, and recognizing that that's still a good thing and that God's still in that. The psalm, in quotes, that goes with that is actually out of Isaiah chapter 12, all 6 verses of it. And this is then recognizing that. And when we're recognizing the gift of life in which we have, that we give thanks to God, and recognizing that we continue to trust and not be afraid, because the Lord is our strength and our salvation, and that this gives us joy, that we are able to proclaim who God is to all people and sing the praise of who God is throughout the whole earth, and that this is a uniting factor for us. The other Old Testament text then is out of Malachi chapter 4, verses 1 to 2a. And this is a moment where we recognize that there is evil that is around us, but that the Lord takes care of it. As long as we continue to put our trust in God, that through this there is healing and there is essentially resurrection for us because of who God is, and recognizing and believing in that. And the psalm that goes with that then is out of Psalms, and it's Psalm 98, all 9 verses of it. And it's recognizing the marvelous things that God has done, and that He has given us victory in our plight, in our time of trouble. This recognizing of the steadfast love and the faithfulness that God has had for the whole tribes of Israel. And this then brings forth this idea of being joyful and recognizing what God is doing, singing unto the Lord with lyre and melody, and giving everything that we have and recognizing all that we can do, that this is praising who God is, and that the whole earth should be rejoicing and joining in this praise of God. The epistle text or second reading then is from 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 from verses 6 to 13. And this then is recognizing, because we are heirs of Christ, because we are in the family of Christ, that we have an expectation within ourselves that we need to uphold. That Paul then is recognizing when he was going to Thessalonica and his people with him, recognizing that they were not being lazy, that they were still contributing to the society. And part of this was so that the people would be able to imitate what they were doing and being an example, recognizing that we weren't just sitting around and recognizing purely that following after God was the only thing that we were doing. We were still contributing and being very vital parts to our society, being productive within society, not being busybodies, recognizing that as we are called within being followers of Christ, that we are called to interact with this society. We're not called to just purely only study the word and not interact with the society, but instead be an example so that society is drawn to us by the example of who we are being and calling us into that. The gospel text this week then is out of Luke chapter 21, verses 5 to 9. And Jesus is with people and talking at the temple, and people are adoring the temple and how beautiful it is. And Jesus then comes back with, in verse 6, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." And they're asking about this, and Jesus kind of continues on with not being led astray and making sure that we are staying essentially the tight and narrow path, that we're not getting pulled aside, recognizing that there will be times where nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there'll be great earthquakes and all these different signs from heaven. But people are still going to persecute you. They're going to make things difficult, but continue to stay in the Lord. Continue to recognize what is in front of you, making sure that you are continuing to follow after God, even when others are hating you or disowning you in certain ways because of what you believe, because of what you are standing for, and recognizing that the endurance of what we are going for will go beyond what we see in this lifetime, recognizing that this endurance, we gain our souls as we get in verse 19, but this idea of us being welcomed into something so much bigger than what we fully understand and what we are fully seeing here at this time and in this place, recognizing that that is more important than being criticized at this time from what we are able to understand right now. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plug. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their sermon brainwaves, podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and ways to be thinking about these texts, digging into these texts. And it's super important for having these great, amazing resources to be able to help us be prepared for this week in the worship. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it because it's one of these great resources to help prepare you for being either in front or in the pews themselves. The other one I would highly recommend checking out is the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy all the layout, the text week to week, but also having art, prayers, hymns, other daily readings to kind of get you into the text week after week. I'd highly recommend checking this out. I know for me, it is an extremely valuable resource, especially being able to look at the art, looking at how they lay out the text week to week. This is another great resource, another great tool to have in your tool belt to be able to help you prepare for that week, whether you are in front of the pews or in the pews themselves. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt Divinity Library as another great resource to help you prepare week after week. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies throughout the upper Midwest and the world beyond. And it's this idea here of being able to take these weekly readings, much similar to like what you're listening to, but taking them from more of an ecological lens. So if you enjoy listening to this podcast week after week for a half an hour, I know you're going to enjoy checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. That'll be the first link down in the show notes in the references section. We talked a little bit about the response that we had for this last week was thinking about wisdom. And I think when we look into that, wisdom is a difficult thing to be thinking about. It's a hard concept at times for us to get our heads around and to be able to recognize, is this the right thing to do? And I'd argue right now, that's one of the things that we are actually seeing within science being discussed and talked about a lot. And there's a good example of this that we'll get into here in a few minutes. But it also gets into when we are looking at things, when we are studying things, when we are questioning and trying to deepen our understanding of who God is, we have to keep making sure that we're not being led astray. We have to continue to be critical thinkers. We need to continue to think about and contemplate, does this make sense with who we understand God to be? Is it something that we need to change our own individual stance on something? Or are we misunderstanding something that leads into something bigger? And I think there is a great example of this, and that is looking into a little bit of the study of Dr. Kate Adamala. Dr. Kate Adamala does her research through the University of Minnesota, and she had a $4 million grant given to her in 2019 to look into mirror cells. Now, in order for us to break this down, we need to go a little bit deeper. We talked a couple weeks back about some of the different things that have happened specifically in women's health history and how that has impacted women's health in general. But one of them we talked about was thalidomide, was this morning sickness drug that was given to Europeans, and thalidomide ended up having long-term ramifications because of chirality. Now, chirality, think of it this way. When you look at your left hand and your right hand, they don't perfectly line up, right? They are mirror images of each other. But if you lay your hands and you keep your hands in the same direction, they don't line up perfectly, just like you need a glove for your left hand and your right hand because they are different, but they are mirror images of each other. That is chirality. And when we talked about thalidomide, it was this idea of understanding that there was one side of it that was able to help with morning sickness. We assumed the other way didn't have any effect. And we found out, no, it was causing birth defects. And so this is chirality. And this is something that's not necessarily new. In the 1800s, mid-1800s, Louis Pasteur was able to talk about this and recognize that there was this chirality within molecules. And recognizing from a chemistry perspective, it makes sense that there is both a left version and right version of something. But the interesting thing is that it seems like when it's coming from life, coming from nature, there is a preferred way of it working. That either nature prefers the right or the left. And so thus looking at like DNA always circles to the right. It's always that way. We look at like amino acids and proteins. They purposely, one is right, one is left, so that they work together and are able to do their functions. But our bodies are looking for, and life in general are looking for them to be a specific way. And now this has been something that has been then looked at and theorized on why is it this way. And there's some different tests and different theories based off of that. One even including the idea of how magnetic fields within our Earth probably favored one way or the other way based off of being able to get all of the molecules of one type together and thus being able to potentially create something that favored one over the other. But I digress. That's not what we're getting into. We're talking about this chirality feature. So with this, there has been a lot of study that has gone into chirality and thinking about, well, what would happen if you were able to get it from the other way? If you were able to more than just taking a single molecule, for instance, but being able to get it further to like a cell. And for the last decades, this has seemed like something that is far off. We've been able to do it for individual molecules, but being able to do a whole cell seems crazy. And there's been definitely things where we think about if we were able to make a mirror cell, it could potentially lead to some very key things that could drastically impact our lives. For instance, a lot of like the cancer drugs and things that we have, part of what happens is they are ingested, our body takes on a response because it recognizes that molecule structure, and so it slowly degrades over a period of time within our bodies. Well, if you were making it in the mirror way, our bodies wouldn't be looking for it in the mirror way, and so thus it would be able to stay in our bodies for an indefinite period of time, and thus making it so that it was easier to be able to have potential cancer drugs or things that would have long-term ramifications. But with that being said, that also could potentially lead to things getting out of hand, because our whole world, our whole ecosystem is based off the idea of looking for things in a specific orientation. They are either left or right in these molecules. And if we're playing around with that, how does that not get out of control? How does that not get out of hand, and thus having the possibility of destroying the world as we know it? Because suddenly it is able to put stuff into our bodies, being able to create mirror bacterias or different things of that nature, and our body has no defenses and no way of even being able to recognize it, thus causing this huge disruption that is not just isolated to like one bacteria, it's isolated to our whole global existence, because nothing has immunity. There is nothing that is a predator of it, because it's completely backwards of everything, how our world has evolved to work. So yes, from a chemistry perspective, this makes sense that you would have both, but from a biology perspective and how all living life has evolved, it has evolved to look for one specific chirality of these molecules and thus cells coming off of that. So to have something as in the opposite could destroy everything that we know. So this gets back to this grant of $4 million. She ended up rejecting it after doing studies. And this was something that was her lifelong thing that she thought, yes, this would be so amazing. But as she was studying and getting into it, she recognized this isn't the way things should be. And in fact, has published papers talking about we really shouldn't look into this until we are 100% confident on how this is going to be. Because right now, yes, it could be beneficial or it could destroy life as we know it, and we don't know which way it would go. And so thus, she has worked with other scientists to be able to essentially sign this petition and agree that there are other ways we are able to look at and research this type of stuff without necessarily doing this, and we won't create mirror cells until we know what the result will be. This to me is miraculous and amazing. And then yes, there is still being pushed back and a lot of discussion back and forth on whether or not we should create mirror cells or not. But I digress. This idea of having these debates and trying to have people have come to an educated standpoint of stating this is what we should do and why, I think is really important. It gets back to, I think, a lot of what the gospel text is. This gospel text of when Jesus is stating that these things will be thrown down, these things that are looked at as with prestige, and yet that's not going to last. And that you're going to have the chaos go on around you, and you're going to have this rising up and people not necessarily agreeing with you, people not necessarily thinking that your wisdom is necessarily good, but to stay the course and stay true to what the wisdom that the Holy Spirit, without being said, has given you. And that's one of the things I think that's so important here is Dr. Kate Alamala has stayed true to what her roots are. She wanted to look into this, but then as she got into it and started thinking about it and looking at it further, she's gotten to the point where no, we can't continue as business as usual. This is something that we need to pursue in different ways and proceed with caution to make sure that we are thinking about it in the correct way. And is that not also what we are getting out of the 2 Thessalonians text this week, where Paul is calling out the people who are early Christians who are deciding, no, they're giving up everything of this world to purely follow after Jesus and what it means to be an early Jewish Christian at that time, and that they're not contributing to the rest of society. They're not laying a good example, and Paul calls this out. Paul is calling out the idea that that is not wisdom. That is not what you are called to be. You are called to be an example for the rest of the world, so thus you still need to interact with that part of the world. In order for us to recognize the beauty of what God has done, we still have to be part of it, not be set apart. We have been set apart, but we still need to interact with the rest of God's creation in order for us to understand and be able to appreciate what God has done. And that is stuff that we see in the Micah text and the Isaiah text this week, and definitely in both of the Psalms, in quotes, the Isaiah 12 and Psalm 98, talking about how the beauty of what God has created and giving thanks to that, but we still need to be able to interact with it in order for us to get to a place where we can recognize the praise that is deserved because of what God is doing. Recognizing the beauty of our world being set aside and that we do have the creation of both of these, but that biology is preferring one of these chiralities is amazing. It's amazing that we have gotten to this point. It is amazing that we are also able to look and approach these things and recognizing, ooh, this could potentially be harmful, and stating that let's do additional research to make sure that if we need to come back down this road again, that we are more confident in what the result is going to be. We have a better hypothesis than taking a shake of the dice, because we understand how much of our world is based off of one orientation and not the other. There's wisdom in that. There's wisdom to making sure that we don't get caught up in our own success. We don't get caught up in the idea of what this could be, that we're thinking about it from all perspectives and weighing those equally, not just because we want to see something from one way or the other. And I think that, to me, in and of itself is amazing. We have to remember it is easy for us to get caught up in the awe of like the temple or the awe of what the research could be. But we still need to think about what the ramifications as well on what our actions are as well. If we don't think about that, that's when we get led astray and we miss the beauty of what God has done in front of us, and we start trying to take things into our own hands and thus end up making things harder for us. So the question I have for you this week is, where has wisdom guided you? Where has wisdom guided you? I think this debate right now that science is running into with chirality is a wisdom discussion. It's recognizing and taking the research of what we know, figuring out ways that we can continue looking into this research and deciding when we have gotten to a point, if we can go back to this style and maybe getting to the aspect of cloning a cell in its mirror image and knowing a little bit with more confidence on how that result is going to be. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. A lot of wisdom. Making sure that we don't necessarily open quote unquote Pandora's box without making sure that we have used all our other resources to make sure that we're not causing complete destruction of the beauty of what God has created in and of itself. I think it gets back to the heart of this idea of, yes, we have a desire to know and to understand, and that is a very important part of who we are. And I think God really does want us to explore and understand as much as we can. But with that also comes responsibility. The responsibility to make sure that we have good ethics, and when we're studying things and thinking about things and as we are learning things, making sure that we are approaching it with good ethics as well. Not just because we have this desire to know, but understanding that this desire to know also needs to be in good health and good mindset for all. When we get jealous or envious, it's really easy for us to get caught up in, well, if I understand this, we miss out on the potential downfalls of these ramifications. And that's where, for me, as I was listening and looking at these mere cells, I can understand their excitement, but I can also understand the amount of wisdom that it must also take to slow yourself down and say, there's other ways we can get some of this information so that we have a better understanding of where we're at. It also gets us so that we're not building up something to be this large temple and admiring it and seeing it just fall in front of us. Not getting caught up in ourselves, recognizing that there's still more beauty to what God has created around us that we can learn from, than being stubborn and saying this is the way that it has to be. And I enjoy so much when science does that, when we actually follow through with those processes and learn. And it's something that I think within our own lives, it can be very helpful for us to realize that there is a time and a place to be headstrong. And there's times and places that have the wisdom to realize this is not a time and a place to be headstrong. And that's a hard line to walk. And so I appreciate scientists being able to have that question and work that through to make sure they're not being headstrong and causing irrevocable potential damage from being headstrong. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.